afternoon. Oh, it does work. Hurrah. It's nice when the tech all works, isn't it? Good afternoon. So we are here to end your day with a bit of inspiration. What's the expression? Inspiration and perspiration? We'll try to do more inspiration and less perspiration to talk about artificial intelligence and what is going to happen in the future, or rather, probably what is already happening in the present. So I'm Sarah Weir, and I run the Design Council. And I have with me a panel of people who all are going to talk about the subject from quite a different set of areas, and I'll introduce them all separately in a second. But just to set the scene, if you like. So the Design Council, and I was sitting this morning and listening particularly to the Minister, the Secretary of State rather, and in some of the sessions, and thinking about design being very much something that is a doing thing. So the word design wasn't necessarily mentioned all that much this morning because it's in everything. You know, the guy from Jaguar, who is the director of design or the head of design, that's what he does all day long. So he's talking about creativity and tech. He doesn't almost need to say design because that's it. That's the thing that joins all those things together. So that's why this expression, making life better by design, that's what we do. And we do it in 4 ways, which rather wonderfully going to fit incredibly well with the 4 people that are going to speak. That was all by design as well. So the first is about places. So not just your home, but where you live, and thinking about those places connected to infrastructure, connected to those jobs. What is tech going to do for all of that? The second is about products. We've heard quite a lot about products this morning. The 10-cent guy, the McDonald's, the going shopping and not paying for your shopping because it's all going to be registered through your face and you pay automatically on the way out. It all sounds slightly scary to me, but I'm sure it's actually all that sort of surveillance and face recognition has already been used by the police for years and years. So just is bringing it more out into the open. So that's products. The third is the processes. So how things are made and how they happen, because it isn't just about all about how it looks. You know, getting that car to being the car was a massive amount of processes that he didn't really touch on hugely, probably because they're so just inherent in the way that he works, which I thought was interesting. And then the last is performance, because if we get the first 3 right, we all do better. And as Matt Hancock was talking about this morning, the creative industries, tech, seen around the world as a global leader, seen as a place where people are going, how did you do that? How did you grow your tech sector so quickly? How can we have a little bit of that? And that is something, if we get that right, that then works for all of us as people, first and foremost, and then it works for productivity and for the economy. But it has to start with the person, I think, rather than just getting lost in, you know, economic productivity. So that's an intro, and I'm going to start with Ed. Actually, what is really nice is that both BDP and I'm sure you've all scoured from cover to cover your Createch 100, that both BDP and Space Syntax are in that 100. And I thought, oh, great. I've got 2 of the winners on the panel. And of course, Google itself and Accenture, who you'll hear about in a minute, are already leaders. I mean, they would be too big to be even in this book. So I reckon we've got 4 of the winners here. It's the top panel. You're in the right place. So, Ed, do you want to kick off?
Yeah.
And each of them are going to speak for about 5 minutes. Set the scene, and then we'll open things up and have a bit of a conversation.
Okay, do you have the clicker? Thank you.
Always helps.
So I'm going to hopefully pick up all 4 of those, the 4 Ps. I'm going to kind of start. I think the thing that we're really interested in at Space Syntax is how we can use data on place to understand performance. And if we can start to analyse cities, understand the systems in cities and how they interact with each other, we can start to make a whole series of decisions around how we can design them better, how we can deliver services better, and basically how we can make things better in everyday life for people. Traditionally, we've worked with data on the physical network, street networks, land use, density, those sorts of things. In the last couple of years, we started to include demographic data and start to pull in a whole series of different kind of data sets. Now, what that means that we can do, as we've started to make these slightly more complicated models, it always sounds a bit kind of back to front, but actually if you make a more complicated model, the answers that you can get out of it, you don't need to be trained to understand. And so what we've got on the screen at the moment is a model of Milton Keynes. It shows for every house in the city how dependent you are on having a car. So we can work out how many jobs you can get to by car versus how many you can get to by public transport. This is only from looking at how those physical systems interact with each other. We know that it correlates with the census data about how people actually get to work. So there's something just from the way the physical systems fit together puts in place a whole series of constraints about what people can and can't do. Now, because we've got these different measures that mean something to people outside of a space syntax background, it means we can work in a different way. And what we did was we gave a model like this to Exeter, to East Devon and Devon County Council, to the Public Health Department. They started to analyse it against their health data. And they started to get these really interesting findings that were relating places where you got high levels of frailty to places which were more dependent on having a car, high levels of obesity to bits of the city that were less walkable. It's a really interesting whole series of findings that are coming out of it. As soon as you get into public health, you get into this horrible discussion about causation and correlation. And we can't guarantee, if you design a city the right way, we can't guarantee that everybody will be healthy because of the way you've designed it. You could walk to work, but still eat 10 Mars bars every night and play PlayStation. What we can do, though, is you can make it possible for somebody to walk to work. And if you design the systems in the right way, you can make certain outcomes possible. If you design them the wrong way, you can completely prevent that from happening. Now, the other thing we can do with these models is pull in the demography data, and we can run different models on that. So we can an example is that we can take data from the census, we can look at the age of people, a whole series of different characteristics, and we can look at things like the risk of social isolation in elderly people. We can combine that with the infrastructure risk that we get from here, so we can see where you get higher risk populations. There might be elderly people who are more dependent on having a car. That means you can start to deliver services in a different way. I'm going to quickly show you a couple of examples about how we've started to build on these findings in terms of, it means we can start to design out these conditions in future. We can also look at how you deliver services to mitigate the constraints they put in place. Now, this is looking at how, this is Astana, it's looking at how you can extend the city for 2050. From the learnings that we've had about what makes a city work well, we have a generative design process where we're taking in a whole series of different sets of data about the environmental conditions, the city, analysing it, how it works, with then growing a new piece of city that creates the conditions which are most associated with positive outcomes. This is something which a lot of the work that has gone into this has come from a mixture of places that might not seem obvious to begin with. There's a lot of analysis of unplanned settlements and slums as well as planned cities. Planned cities don't always work the way people want them to. Unplanned settlements often do things which are really positive. So there's a whole series of interesting relationships that have gone into why this grows the way it does. Initially, we start by generating the network. We then look at where particular land use mixes are best suited. And there's things that we find in places like London. 80% of the shops are on the top 20% of the best connected streets. So what we've got the colour diagrams on here. The red blocks are where you would expect to get more commercial uses, more retail, higher densities. The yellow is more residential, lower densities. And so there's a whole relationship between the structure of the network and the way that things are distributed within that network. Now, this only shows the kind of bigger scale things. There was a whole series of kind of smaller scale studies which were about things like public realm, the interface between buildings, all of those sorts of smaller scale considerations. I guess there's some interesting things that maybe we'll pick up in the panel rather than in this section, which is we've been talking about this at Space Syntax as being augmented design rather than automated design. You still need people involved in the process, and you still need people to make decisions to drive that process and to communicate with people, get input from local stakeholders and people that know the city really well. It would be possible to automate bits of it, but we don't think that you should. So we think it's more about the process of augmented design. There's questions again about exactly what you design and why. And this question of the future role of the designer, I think, is really interesting, and what skill sets you need and how you manage this kind of local and global perspective on things. Now, the last thing that I'm going to show is the other end of the scale. This is about how you mitigate around physical conditions which are already in place. This is a Newton-funded project that we're doing with another UK SME called Inavia. This is a product that takes a piece of software that manages personal data, and it uses that personal data to link to health records and things. We're connecting that to a model of the city in Sao Paulo, and we're using that to provide tailored individual recommendations based on where people are in the city, what the risks are to particular conditions, and a whole series of It's basically a way of providing a service that overcomes the physical constraints of the city and works around that. There's also, within this way that it's put together, there's a route to take data from the individual level, to anonymise it, aggregate it and feed it back to the city so that the city can understand what's happening where and start to unpick what some of the systems are that might be contributing to that. So basically, I think as a summary, the big opportunity that I think we have within the emerging tech is how we can really use spatial intelligence and how we can start to develop specific responses through policy, whether it might be things like pricing strategies, designing the actual design process and service delivery.
Fantastic. So for anyone that thought that data was dull, I think that's quite a good explanation to show that it's completely fascinating, actually. Where's Astana, by the way?
Astana, sorry.
Astana, right.
Kazakhstan.
Right, thank you. I'm sure you probably all knew that, but I didn't, so I thought I'd just ask the daft question. Alistair,
yes.
what would you like to
Well,
add to this debate?
what I think is probably worthwhile starting off with is assuming that data isn't dull. Data is valuable.
Yeah.
And BDP, my company, we're architects and engineers. And unfortunately, within the architecture, engineering, construction space, we are extremely backward about adopting technology. So what I want to talk about very briefly is, where Ed's talked about the city and the district vision, what I want to talk about is the building and how data can be used and is beginning to be used to drive greater value and better outcomes for building users, and really building for a smarter, more determined outcome. Now, at the start, I'll also say I hate the word smart. It's about connected information for me, and it's that connectivity that's valuable. Everything's branded as smart, and actually, whether smart water is actually all that smart, who knows? So it's also about the Digital Built Britain strategy. For those of you that aren't aware of it, please go and look it up, because everything that is driving architecture, engineering, construction at the moment to do with technology is focused around the Digital Built Britain strategy. And architecture, engineering, construction industry is changing. It's moving from a two-dimensional world to one where building information modelling and data-rich models are standard working practice. This here is the series of models that we created for Alderhay Children's Hospital. Sorry, my slides have all disappeared. Alderhay Children's Hospital was completed in 2015 and has gone on to be voted the best building of the decade in the northwest of England. But the point about it is that building information modelling is centred around a database. But within that, you can connect other data sources and visualise and repurpose data in many different ways. So you have this single source of collected, verified data that can be used to generate schedules, generate three-dimensional models, generate traditional plan views, can be used for building metrics, can be used for off-site manufacturing and automation. And all of these begin to suggest how technology can drive better building outcomes. Now, what this is here is the floor plate of the office that I work with it. It is a little video, but I can't quite get it running at the moment, but I'll try and explain what you can see. The green spots here are our wireless hotspots. And everything in dark blue are Wi-Fi connected devices that are passing information through those hotspots. Everything in light blue have registered against but aren't passing information through these hotspots. So all of a sudden we understand where individuals actually are within that floor plate, how people working on that floor plate are interacting with each other. And actually, we also understand the information they are passing through onto our network, out to the internet and back, what they're consuming and what they're producing in terms of data. And this begins to suggest interesting things. Understanding what Ed was showing about people movement across districts. We understand movement across the floor plate, so we can understand how teams interact together, what parts of the floor, what parts of the interior design are considered valuable and useful and productive and what aren't. So when we come to to look at how the space is being used. We can replan based on the activity that we see. But it also begins to suggest other potential benefits. Because, as I say, it's about transferring information to and from, capturing and repurposing. And we move into the point where everybody has these wearable devices now, Fitbits, app trackers. I mean, I've got one on, I saw that Ed did, I don't know who else has got one. But these devices are capturing metrics about ourselves. So here, we're looking at heart rates, walking distance, flights climbed. But we're beginning to see more of these advancements in the medical arena. So we can capture user data, the individual user performance, if you like. And there is the potential to then understand how that relates back to the buildings that we're occupying. And I think that we're not far away from being able to use these to understand, in the education space, how we can improve education outcomes. In the workplace, how we can improve productivity and workplace outcomes by tailoring the building to the occupants and the occupants' perception and actual physical condition within the building, but most importantly, healthcare. I had a slide, it's disappeared, but to understand that healthcare outcomes are directly related to the environment that people are put in. We design a lot of hospitals, and we understand that actually having smaller wards, having 6-bed wards or individual rooms provide better outcomes. How a view to the outside, a window provides better outcomes. How the systems within wards themselves and how they operate can help healthcare outcomes. So it's all about improving that, the individual's position, rather than simply creating a building that performs a function but doesn't move and interact within itself. So I think that we're at a really exciting time. I think that architecture engineering is lagging behind, but there's a huge amount that can be done in an open, supportive way to improve society overall.
Fantastic. And I think what's really interesting out of that one is seeing how you get the design right, the process just as much as the thing. It then has multiple uses. So it's building on your data thing. You're using the data in one way, but then it can have 4 or 5 or 6 other uses as well. That's brilliant. Mustafa, Google.
Hello. So what I want to talk about is, I suppose it's like interesting building onto the process and how we actually build creative and collaborative environments at Google and what Google is doing around the actual design. So I'm a design advocate. When I say, hello, I'm a design advocate, most people look at me blankly, like, you see the blood drain from their face because they don't know what that means. But I'm basically a UX designer, and I'm advocating design best practice from Google's perspective. So be it advocating good things, material design, which is our design language, design sprints, which is our design process, which heavily adopted stuff from the Design Council, is divergent, convergent thinking, design tooling, which is an area that we're getting into, so we just released a tool called Gallery, which allows you to collaborate, and progressive web apps, that's how you can make websites have app-like behavior, how you can make them work offline, and sort of how to design these best practices so that, especially in economies and areas of the world which have really shoddy internet connections, how you can still give users a good user experience, and basically advocating that through and through. So, but what I'd like to talk about is design sprints. Who's heard of a design sprint? Okay, so basically it's our process of coming up with an idea and learning about it. What you typically find is a startup will come up with an idea, they'll build something, they launch it, and then they learn whether it's a success or a failure. That can take 12 to 18 months and could cost a lot of money, especially in Silicon Valley where VC money is is all over the place. A lot of companies lose a lot of money as a result of this. So the design sprint process is about how you can come up with an idea and learn as quickly as possible. So typically, from a startup point of view, it's broken down to like a 5-day process. Although last week I was in Berlin and we did with Delivery Hero, they own Hungry House and many of their kind of food services. We did like 1 in 2 days. So you have like an understand phase where you get a team together from different disciplines in a company, so from marketing to sales to accounts and design. I mean, the term design sprint is quite misleading. It's not necessarily about designers, it's about engaging a whole company together. So the first phase, people give lightning talks, sort of have a shared understanding. Second day, everybody sketches an idea. Third day, people decide together in a very democratic fashion. Fourth day, people prototype, and on a 5th day, they validate. The core thing is you're always validating the thing, and this is where the learning is happening, to make sure that the thing that you're proposing and building, there is a need and a value for that. My slides, the typeface has gone completely crazy, so that makes my design skills look really bad. It's like, what's he talking about design for? So some of the products that we produce use this design. Like we have this thing of like eat your own dog food. So the things that you advocate, you also do yourself. So it's good enough for the dog, it's good enough for you. Self-driving car, design sprints heavily used in that. The wearable design, so like how you advocate or educate designers and engineers how to build for Weir. Like the whole documentation was used for design sprints because it's not just about a very product-centric thing. And Project Loon, which most people hadn't really heard about until last year when there was all the disasters that were happening. So Project Loon is basically air balloons that provide internet access to like regions of the world where it's not feasible to have cables. So in natural disasters that happened, I think in the islands near America, so Haiti, whatever, like, that was a great way of at least getting internet connectivity so people can at least alert emergency services and stuff. And all these were like created through design sprints. So it's a process that we really heavily advocate, and it's used quite heavily in Silicon Valley. So if you have any more questions afterwards, then please let me know. So.
Fantastic. And the thing that comes through for me on that is about speed. Speed of change. Things are changing very fast, but it's how we can take everybody, like in this room and everyone else, along with that change without people feeling, oh gosh, I don't even know how to get onto. I don't know what a sprint is. And it's I think, getting rid of some of the language where people aren't sure what things are and see that actually it's all about us and we're the ones that make the change and make things go.
Yeah, I think there was the other small question is ethics as well, I think, which we can go into in the discussion.
We'll go on to that in the discussion, I think, because that's quite a big issue.
Yeah, exactly.
We will do that one.
Okay.
Right, so last but very much not least, Chloë from Accenture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I lead a number of our biggest, most complex digital transformations within financial services, and I think there is a tendency to yawn a little bit when we say digital transformation, and I think it's very much a term that's been overused. I do feel quite passionately about doing digital transformations in the right way. I think there are certainly wrong ways to go about it, and I think what I'd like to talk about is our impact on financial services from a digital perspective. So I think it's clear that digital and artificial intelligence have had an unprecedented impact on our daily lives and on our experience of dealing with financial services. Our always-on, ever-connected, 24/7 expectations of digital services, the boundary and the bar has been set high by frictionless experiences from Uber, from Netflix, and people expect more on a day-to-day basis. That, coupled with the business continued pressure on costs, means businesses and customers more and more look to digital in order to help them with their day-to-day lives. I think that, coupled with the fact that there's definitely a decreased sense of trust with brands, and therefore the level of brand value and brand importance from a digital perspective is becoming less and less important than the actual services that you're providing to customers. But there's a dark side to digital, and in an era of branch closures, high street decline, and ever-increasing shift to self-serve and the need to automate transactions, are we losing sight of the need to help our customers and their financial well-being? Who's really thinking about the customer? Every day I speak to clients and they want digital platforms, they want a digital transformation, they want to digitise the customer experience to drive growth and to decrease costs. Sorry, I'm just looking at which slides have been removed. But I think platform tech and procurement processes need to be guided in the right way, and at the moment they focus very, very highly on technical capability as opposed to customer experience and customer needs. And in our digital era, with reduced levels of human contact, are we really thinking about people's financial well-being? The diagram that I had kind of drawn out was a real-life example of an insurance journey, and what we've done is we've mapped out the end-to-end touch points, and I think on my colleague's journey to claim for their when the house had flooded, they had to make 65 calls over a period of 11 and a half hours. And actually what we're seeing is that fragmented functions, not just in financial services, but in other service providers, these fragmented functions within banks, within insurance companies, within our day-to-day providers, equal fragmented decisions, and the customer feels the pain of these fragmented decisions before anyone internally does. And I think if we can simply think and ideate on a solution to address a problem and better meet customer needs, deliver what you promise, promptly fix what goes wrong, and know your customer problems, I think they are the key things that we need to focus on. Because ultimately, tech is only as brilliant as the ideas and strategy which drive it. And we need design-led thinking at the heart of any business and any digital transformational strategy, coupled with the right level of business organisational change to make sure that we're creating a culture that's focused on the right way of solving problems for customers. Everyone wants to achieve the best lifestyle that they can by making their money work as hard as possible, but only few really understand how and where they can spend smarter. We can help people. We can use the data, we can use the data models, create the right UX, use our APIs, and create a customer experience which people love. And by creating that customer advocacy and helping people to manage their money and really creating experiences that people love, we can create that sustainable advocacy and traction in our era of uncertainty. So let's focus, let's obsess about customer needs, and be ready to pivot before we build the best engine.
Very good, thank you very much. I actually was thinking about language, because several of you have said there are words that either you use or you don't use or you now don't like smarter and digital transformation and sprints. And I think language is really important because it can be incredibly alienating. If you know, just going back to what was the place in Kazakhstan again? Sorry.
Astana.
Astana. You know, say Astana was a word that was used every day, and actually lots of us didn't know what it was or where it was. You would nod and smile, but you think you haven't got a clue. Therefore, you feel very outside things. And I think this is a world where it can be the case, as we've talked about small things and big things in the 4 presentations that you've given. But fragmentation, I think, is also something that things can fall apart if you haven't got the person at the centre. So to kick us off, and as I know when you go for questions, you ask the questions, everyone sort of sits there and doesn't say anything. So I'm going to ask one just to get us going, which is to ask all 4 of you, if there was one thing that would take away a barrier to some of the work that you're trying to do at the moment, is there something that springs to mind? Maybe a small thing, maybe a simple thing that you would like to do now, that if we could unlock one thing, it would make a big difference. So I haven't prepped them that I was going to ask them that question. So for those that are more reflectors, they won't want to go first, but hopefully somebody is a sort of, oh, I'll jump in and answer it.
Okay, I can jump in. I think there's lots of things that I would want to change. I would say that something which is really difficult is the procurement process in the UK. And when it comes to doing something innovative, then that's often not reflected in the process you have to go through. Often stuff is procured based on the methodology you go through, and it pre-describes what you need to do rather than what the outcome could be. There's some really interesting places. I think Oxfordshire County Council is doing some really interesting stuff, entering into innovation partnerships with suppliers where you basically co-create something with them rather than necessarily providing a traffic model and using this particular software or this particular model. They're really interested in what are the outcomes and how do we get there in a better way.
I think procurement is a really big one, and it's another one of those words, a bit like your digital transformation, eyes glaze over, procurement process, not interested. Whereas actually, nothing happens unless the procurement is right. So that's a brilliant one, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on what you said, because one of the things that I think holds technology back are technology advocates in themselves.
Right.
I within the realms of what I work in, it becomes incredibly frustrating that you have all of these experts, all of these magicians and wizards that get together in their groups, talk about technology in terms of acronyms, nod sagely, will show their captive audience tricks, and then go away without actually explaining it in simple language that lay people can understand. And certainly what I see, that's a huge barrier to technology adoption within the architecture and construction industries.
So it's the technology echo chamber.
But it's also the kind of the self-gratifying groups that get together, talk increasingly knowledgeably, increasingly more and more acronyms, without actually understanding that it's not the technology itself that matters, it's the outcomes that fall out of the technology being delivered properly that
I hope there's
matters.
no one in this room who thinks they're a technology advocate and is now feeling a bit, I'm not sure about that. Maybe if you are, you can come back on that one.
I think building on that, for me, it's what we mentioned even earlier. It's like ethics.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges Silicon Valley has is the people designing the things are designing for themselves in their own context, and it's a bit like the equivalent of an Uxbridge collective designing for people from Uxbridge, not really understanding the context of other people, minorities, women, or whatever. So sometimes there's a bit of a shock when there's backlash from the technology. So why do you hate innovation? It's not that. It's because they're not really thinking about minorities or anyone other than middle-class white men, to put it bluntly. So you see this on Twitter, like a soap dispenser that doesn't work with anyone who's got dark skin, because the people designing it are designing in their own context, in their own bubble. And I think that needs to change. And just, I suppose, an industry ethics would be nice, although it's very hard to design that, because that means different things to different people. I mean, last week we released our AI principles, so thinking about when designing artificial intelligence, we should be thinking about what it actually means for the user, rather than what it means for the companies or for the bubble, and the ethics behind that, making sure people are in control of everything that they do, and sort of educate people about what data actually is, because I think there is a bit of mystery behind some of these free services that are provided, like what the actual cost is. I think that's really important, and that should come from us, like from tech.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, the coding. It's something we've been working, actually we're working with the TUC on it, so thinking about who is designing the coding, what sort of people are they, and exactly as you've just said, are they designing for themselves, therefore unconscious bias just automatically gets built in. And the more it happens, we're going to be stuck with that for generations. It's a really big one.
I get particularly irritated because Alexa really recognises my husband's voice, but she doesn't really tend to recognise my voice.
Yeah, well that's a perfect example, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, and I think, going back to your original question, I think shiny object syndrome is a big thing that I see again and again, and I think we tend to see within the organisations I work with, there tends to be the latest shiny technology, and things kind of stub builds are put in, and things are put in, but things aren't properly integrated. So all of the wealth of data that we have, that organisations have, they're not really connecting experiences in the right way. And also, despite having all of the data at the tips of our fingers, even though it's complicated because we've got to move it around and host it in different places and get through regulation and all the rest of it, I think we are still driving decisions very much with a human lens without looking at what the insight tells us. And I think that there's actually a lot more opportunity to use the insight to drive the right business decisions and remove that natural bias that we have as organisations. So I think there are a couple of top of mind things for me.
So less shiny toys. Fantastic. What do you think? What would you like to say? Would you like to ask? Fantastic.
Hi, I work for the university, and we're doing a lot of research about AI, and I think there was some stat that like 75% of AI is either about automation or consuming things, and not a lot is going on in the space of the kind of human things. And until we look at that, so we're looking at it from more artistic ways, but more about how can it, so for instance, AI can read your face and say more about what you're feeling than any human could. So I know you obviously have your consumer hats on, but do you think that it might be more effective if we are less obvious about what we're looking at and less calculated about it maybe, because it can be quite a creative tool?
Isn't the success of it, the real innovation, is going to come from looking past what the next step is. It's something that's going to be disruptive rather than incremental progression, and it's difficult to put your finger on what that will be and where it will come from, but it will come. I think that it's a point well made that AI, certainly in the realms that we're currently looking at, it's about improving process. It's about driving automation. I'm quite sure that Google will be far further past that, but for a general consumer level, it isn't much past just being a bit better than we currently are.
Has anyone else got a view on that? I think it's a really, really good point, really strong point.
I think AI is very hard. It's the thing that we're discovering, and it's almost like this feedback loop that we do something and then we realise, oh, actually, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, because it goes back to the ethics thing. You have a bunch of kids who've never worked anywhere but this and have all these shiny toys. I'm talking about like big tech companies specifically. And so, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do this? How about this? How about, why not this? But no one's asking, like, should they? So with that, and also the stuff that we're creating is in the context of that environment. I think once AI becomes more accessible, like the knowledge to say like India, Nigeria, the stuff that will come out there will be based on their context. That could be far more interesting. And there's stuff going on, like Estonia is the famous EU hub country of desks doing really amazing things. Helsinki, again, as we were speaking earlier, as like a director of design. I think when we start looking at what other cultures and countries are doing, that's where probably most of the interesting things will happen. Otherwise, yeah, it's all going to be about consumption. It's capitalism, right?
I think that there's probably something in there as well, which this might be getting a bit technical, which is that it's only going to be as good as the data that you're giving it as well. And that if you're looking at a city, then you need data on the systems in a city, not necessarily what's actually happening in the city. Otherwise, I mean, you can come up with loads of really good examples of kind of relationships that don't really exist, and that if you build more pubs in this area, you'll get more healthy people. And I mean, that's a very, very crude example, but yeah, you need the right data on the right systems to be able to, and part of it will come back to what are the outcomes that you're really interested in, and understanding that sequence of things in more detail.
Was it Jeff at the front?
You were speaking about best practices, and design thinking. I was just wondering, so when different devices came into play, earlier we just had a computer, now we have mobile and smartwatches, I think that got material design into place, as a best practice. Didn't AI as an industry bring anything into play? Aren't you looking at a new approach, or how do we, project data? How do we personalize data for people?
I mean, it's quite new. Everything is quite new.
Very new?
Yeah, I think, and also we're still trying to learn more the boundaries of what people actually want. I think is the biggest challenge.
For example, she said data visualization for finance. Okay, it's as simple as enhancing a table of data into maybe 3D graphics or 3D visualizations. Isn't that pretty straightforward? I'm wondering how complicated or how we're unable to achieve, this in a context, because whatever you've done is superb.
Again, it depends on specifically what you're actually getting at. I'm not entirely sure what the question.
Okay.
Do
you follow a rule or a best practice when you say, hey, this is an AI project, so I'm going to throw this away and use this, for example?
Well, I mean, at the moment, we're still defining what that's best practice or specific AI. So like I said last week, we produced sort of our principles. So it's still very new to us, I would say. And I think it's going to take time for that sort of best practice, because, and also it's just culturally, I mean, things which are acceptable in the States are not necessarily acceptable in Europe, and, the regulation is very different. So I think there's a lot of those levels. So we're still defining that, is the answer I can only give. I'm
going to say something probably a bit more controversial. I'm not sure that our experience of mobile is the best example of design-led thinking. We're losing human eye contact, we're getting neck and back strain, you're leaning down, many advantages, many disadvantages, physically, mentally, for society, losing human relationships, losing the depth of lots of pieces of society. So I think I would love for us as we progress over the next few years, and I'm sure Google has it in hand, but I'd love us to think about more our basic needs as people, and actually how do we design experiences around that, rather than just through this awful experience that we've created for ourselves.
We have a mixed reality.
Well, that's what I was about to say. Unfortunately, we're constrained by technology.
I understand.
The theory and the potential is has yet really to be discovered. It disappoints me that Google Glass, for example, hasn't progressed in the way it could have. But some of the devices that we're seeing now are beginning to suggest once technology gets to the point that our creativity can actually be realised, I think that type of thing will go away. The mobile phone in the pocket will disappear. But it's the physical technology at the moment just isn't quite capable of what the user experience could be.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think human beings augment the experience themselves. So I know we like to bash mobile phones, but if you go back 60, 70 years on the train, people weren't looking at their phones, they're looking at a newspaper. So, I think there is we carry the cultural baggage of our past. So if you look at the telephone, the invention of the telephone was to be like an advanced radio system. It wasn't supposed to be like a two-way communication.
Yeah.
And people kind of augment and hack the user experience themselves, which I always find is the funniest things. Like the simple example is we create these secure password systems. Then you go to a non-techie environment. The first thing they do is write the password on a sticky and slap it on the side of it, because people hack their experiences. And it's
avoid that. What if we provide tools to interpret that experience? I think mixed reality or a vision does that.
We've had virtual reality since I was a kid, the 80s. But so it's one thing which. And Google Glass, again, I think it was like a technology that was before its time. And touchscreen technology has been around since the 80s, but it took till Apple to really push what that is. And we have the means. It's just
it's ultimately the design.
I think I know it's very fashionable, but I hate the word disruptive. 'Cause, I'm British. Disruption is rude. I think when you're actually mixing, enhancing the experience, or augmenting, I think, or maybe where we become more like cyborgs. So you make it easy to pay for something because the mechanism to pay for something, like the Oyster card or whatever. That is the thing. But that, again, I think that takes a lot of experimentation. If you look at the development of the iPhone, which was quite a big jump in mobile technology. You see the original versions, they iterate on that since 2002, I think, and they released in 2007. It takes a long time. And even then, you're not sure if people are actually...
I think for me, the really key thing is about people. And one of the things that we haven't talked about is things like self-driving cars, and that people keep saying that that's going to be the next big thing. And there's a whole series of questions around who is actually going to be able to afford to be able to use those as a service, and what are the financial models behind it. Some of the risk around the self-driving cars is that there was a proposal, I think, was it last year, the year before, which was about cities basically are for people. And as soon as you start to change the way that you design a city around one technology, has a whole series of negative impacts on other things. We did this with highway design. We've done this from the kind of 50s and 60s up to now, and so many problems in cities come from working around that one technology. There was something that was a proposal, I think, for part of New York, which was about designing it so that a self-driving car could go from one end to the other at 70 miles an hour. That's just repeating the same mistakes that we made in the past. So, if you forget what this thing is for and that people are involved, it's going to create a whole series of unintended negative outcomes.
Well, I always say self-driving car, we call it public transportation. It's just the driver, right? That's kind of but yeah, you're right. I think sometimes when we innovate in a bubble, and I think some of the technologies coming out of the context of San Francisco, which has terrible public transportation, that's why there was self-driving car becomes a need. But yeah, no, you're right. I think we always have to look at mitigating impact. One thing which I discovered recently is in London, we're seeing a decreasing, say, Indian and Bangladeshi restaurants, because a lot of the waiters and chefs are becoming Uber drivers, because it's just so much more pleasant as a working experience. So you see that challenge is being solved of finding a taxi wherever in remote places, but at the same time, what's the negative impact? I think that can sometimes be really hard to figure out. We say, how might we, is the San Francisco way of coming out with an opportunity statement, but why should we? Is the what's the potential? There's a company called Artifact who came up with these 20 tarot cards, where there was one's called the Radio Star. So you turn over and you see, right, you're designing this thing, but which business are you killing as a result of this? And so thinking about what's the environmental impact? What's what happens to local communities? So you see express supermarkets open. What happens to the local businesses? You drain money out of a community. But this can be really hard. Again, it's like if the designers are not in that context.
I think with digital as a whole, I mean, looking at the demise of the high street, I think is a valid case in point. So we're designing these digital experiences which are making lives easier in so many different ways, but then if I think back to your map and the retail areas and the mapping of data, our retail areas are being compressed and reduced, and the sense of community is being diminished as a result of less of a thriving community due to the impact of digital. And I think that when we are designing these experiences, we are moving essentially communities from physical to virtual, and I think that we have to maintain a continued focus on the impacts on society of what we're designing.
Do you not think, though, that view is a reaction to us, our age, and the fact that actually society overall hasn't quite grasped what digital is going to mean for society moving forward? The thing that surprises me, I've got a 16-year-old daughter, and I suddenly realised she doesn't watch television.
Yeah.
She doesn't read books. And she consumes everything from her devices digitally.
Yeah.
And, it's suddenly, I was brought up, I studied architecture, I was the last year that didn't have to produce a CAD drawing to pass. So, I grew up when digital didn't really exist, but the world is so different now. And, even looking at the audience, everybody will know a time, everybody will remember fax machines. I can remember when email didn't exist. Yeah. But we've got generations now coming through where life is just so different, and it's so ingrained in what they do that they don't have the same challenges.
I think we have to redefine, therefore, what brings people together and how you create that. If it isn't what it used to be, I think that we need to put equal measure into making sure that remains a core focus.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is about the high street, and I think that in the last, 20 years or so, high streets have become about retail, and they should be about more than that.
Agreed.
There's something as well, which was, I think it was a Government Office for Science report that was about adoption of connectivity and digital communication stuff, that actually, as everywhere becomes better connected, the demand for face-to-face contact increases. And it doesn't replace it. It doesn't mean that people go and live in the country and kind of work out of their shed. That actually the value of city and the value of place increases, because that's the thing that differentiates your bit of city or that particular place ahead of other stuff. So I think there's something about place is definitely really, really important. It's the differentiator, and it's that the role of the high street will change. It's still something that brings people together. Yeah. And it's something physically about being people.
Well, this is a good conversation. Well, let's break out from these four. Actually, quite an interesting conversation. I think this isn't so much a bubble because there are very differing views, but anyone else who's sitting there thinking, yeah, but they haven't talked about this or that? Yes, hello there.
I was wondering if you ever thought about sort of any scenarios where we have to put some sort of safeguarding for humans against the rapid advances of technology and how they can affect our lives. For example, you had a very good illustration with Alexa annoying you in your family life. As she learns about you and your habits, she might stop talking to you altogether at some point. How do you...
Well, I swore at her actually, and she stopped speaking to me for about a week. I'm not joking.
Really?
Yeah, and I don't know if, and sometimes it beeps when I haven't said Alexa, so I kind of just, I'm not, I'm a bit
well, this is back to the who's doing the programming issue, actually,
but
isn't it?
But I think this is also the point. The part of what this session is supposed to be is the Internet of Things.
Yeah.
Actually, in terms of security, privacy, and all of those aspects, the genie's out of the bottle now. The standards aren't there. The way of controlling it isn't there. And one of the major challenges is to ensure that as this takes hold and as this becomes the norm, that we've put sufficient measures in place to protect everybody. And I know that this is an increasing concern. There's a similar talk on about blockchain, for example. Now that's something that's being presented as a way of controlling transactions and financial transactions. But one of the largest hacks recently was it something to do with Wi-Fi enabled kettles. It was a way of hackers being able to get in, and it's out there now. It's out there now, and
well, I don't know if any of you bank with TSB, but you will know all about it. That's meltdown, wasn't it?
I think financial enablement's an interesting one, because if we think about the world being driven by, it's already driven by risk scoring and algorithms, but as we move to automation, who's deciding who can borrow what, and as we reduce that human contact and the human intervention, how do we make sure that financial access to loans, to mortgages, continues to be equal and fair, and that we're not just prioritising people who look good to an algorithm? And I think making sure that we are remembering financial enablement and balancing that with the need to risk score and control through algorithms, for me, I think is really important.
Well, I think I thought it was interesting when you're talking about Alexa, you're talking as if she was a real person.
I know.
Which I think is one of the things, like being reminded about, that these things are just machines. But yeah, like I said, we're looking at the principles that we released last week. One of them was about biases, was like racial, whatever. And I think we've seen a lot of horrible examples. So like when Microsoft did their bot on Twitter, within 24 hours it became like racist and whatever. It's because you have to be really careful about the data that you feed into it. And so, I mean, I think this is something that we learn with time. If you look at, say, the advancements of any technology, you look at the rules around it, it's pretty liberal to begin with because people don't really understand it. So it's only in the 80s when drink driving was like banned. And I remember seeing a documentary as a kid like this, asking these people, do you think drinking alcohol helps you drive better? Like, yeah, it's fine. Then they let them drive the cars where they're drunk. And yeah, it's swerving, and they're playing the video and they can't believe, it's like, oh my God, that's not me. And I think over time people start developing these standards and regulation. You've seen like the privacy regulation in the EU like recently. I think it just takes time because we're not necessarily aware of what the potential pitfalls are. But I think because we've seen a couple of interesting examples in the last few years, we're starting to develop more better practice of these things. But I think it needs a bit of time because we still don't know what we're doing.
I think there's some...
So we're building the plane as we're flying it.
That's just the nature of the technology that we've seen. So like you look at radio, you look at cars, you look at any kind of technology, the press. Like propaganda and sort of the Second World War was probably one of the most innovative times in human history. It's like airplanes were, and it's quite horrific, but it's quite. It was a time when things were innovated, and then we realised how dangerous these things are, and that's when we said, okay, maybe we need to stop or change our focus.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit which is really interesting in here, which is about transparency and principles and the way that actually stuff is communicated. I think there's a lot of stuff which still exists within a tech bubble, and there's talk about stuff like open source, and open source being a way of allowing people to see what's happening and to actually be able to inspect stuff. But it only makes sense if you can read the code and if you understand whatever language it's been written in. So actually, there's something that making something open by itself isn't just the answer. There's a whole series of other steps that need to go with that, and whether that's talking about principles and the way that things work in general or the actual detail, that I think still needs to be worked through.
Oh, they're clapping early. I reckon we have 4 minutes left, but maybe anyone else got anything they'd like to throw in or ask? Yeah.
I'm curious, going off this discussion about ethics and privacy and security. So much of what we've heard today incentivizes collecting data and leveraging the data to monetize whatever it is you're doing. So how do we reconcile this issue of protecting people if certain countries have different policies? Is the future of AI in certain countries more regulation, whereas the future of AI in other countries no regulation? And are they going to do better?
That's a really good question. Fun enough, it's something which has been going through my head as I was sitting listening to some of the stuff, especially earlier today. Anyone want to have a go at that one in the last 3 minutes?
I'm working with a number of countries at the moment around regulation and use of cloud, and it's really interesting looking at the different approaches because I'm working with the UK and then I'm working with China, and there is a business need to push and deliver, but in many of the countries the regulation isn't in place, the ability to use cloud isn't there, and there's a need to almost design the regulation based on that first business being the first adopter. So the rules and regulations are almost being shaped around that business for that business and will have to be adapted thereafter because they just aren't in place. Whether people will move quicker, faster, better, I'll come back to the hacking thing. I think I've worked with a lot of different markets and seen how they work in different ways, and there are always ways of hacking to do different things with data, whether it's in more of a static data lake versus in the cloud. And of course there is increased efficiency and increased productivity from moving to cloud, But where that doesn't exist, you have to continue to forge your own path to meet your business need. So I don't think that really answers your question, but I think seeing a mixture of different countries and level of maturity, I think where it's not in place, they're having to build that around imperfect use cases.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have to round up there, but that was a great last question.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, go on. Chuck one thing in quickly.
I think just if you look at the way the internet and regulation is, this is probably the template. Say the way internet is used in China is different to the way it's EU, and now America, they've got their whole things going through in the courts at the moment. So I think it's going to follow the same patterns.
So it'll all keep on going. For me, to round up on this, I think it's don't lose people under the pile of shiny tech, because we are still there. We're at the forefront of this. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to Alistair, Ed, Mustafa, Chloë.